If you've been on the internet recently, you've probably heard of Palworld, a game often described as Pokemon with guns. And with it sitting at an affordable $30 on Steam and free with Game Pass, everyone has been rushing to play it. But is the game really worth the hype? Well, when someone first told me about this game, I was somewhat intrigued. After all, I was a huge fan of the Pokemon series, so maybe this could be good. Even more of a selling point to me was that this game was on Game Pass, meaning I could play it without buying anything new. But besides all the hype surrounding the game, there also has been some controversy regarding how Palworld copied the designs of so many Pokemon. To be fair, the resemblance and inspiration is kind of obvious, and borderline is plagiarism at times. And yeah, this could be considered a negative thing, but that's really for the Pokemon company to handle if they want to go ahead with a lawsuit. For now, let's just focus on judging the quality of the gameplay instead. So when I went into this game, I figured I'd go in blind and stream it so I can record my authentic reaction. And well, it's actually a little bit off-putting at first. It's incredibly slow-paced in the beginning parts and isn't exactly easy to understand if you've never played a survival game. Eventually though, you start to understand the things you're capable of doing, and it opens up a ton. To be honest, I really didn't have an intention of playing more than an hour or two of this game, but it hooked me. When you first load up a world, you're sent to a pretty cool character creation screen that for some reason allows you to make your characters look like this. But after this, you get dropped in a random place with a little explanation of what to do. To many fans of the Pokemon series, this game will immediately remind you of Legends Arceus, but for everyone else, it's like many other popular survival games like Ark. But much differently from Pokemon, this game is a lot more complicated than it seems. This game basically gives you complete freedom without leaving you in the dark, and honestly, it kinda reminds me of that freedom you got in the beginning of Breath of the Wild. But yeah, for the first few minutes of the game, I thought you had to play it like Minecraft, and I started punching a tree. I quickly learned that this was largely an inefficient way of gathering wood, and I learned how to craft tools and capture pals. Someone in my live stream chat suggested getting this cat-like one, and I used this for a while to do some stuff like mining. Oh, and I guess I should also mention that in this game you can actually see the catch rate when you try and catch a pal, unlike Pokemon. Eventually I realized what I had to do with the whole base creation thing, and then I started to play the game somewhat like it was intended. I noticed that there was this little tab at the top saying what the tutorial section of things were, and I decided to follow it. Eventually I started catching an incredible amount of these lamb balls and started to fill my base with workers. Figuring out how this whole base automation thing worked was one of my biggest reasons why I got hooked to this game. The fact that I could set things up so I could go on an adventure and come back with a bunch of resources in my chest is pretty awesome. Throughout this whole process, by the way, I'm keeping in the back of my mind that this is a free game for me because it was on Game Pass. And already this early into the game, I'm more impressed with this than something like Legends Arceus, and that was a game with an insanely higher budget than this. But we'll talk more about the game's development later. Next, I want to delve deeper into the actual combat system of this game. So this is pretty much what you would expect. You send out your pal and it fights for you. I mean, technically you can attack too, but the main damage will be from your pals. At first, you're just letting it do its thing, and maybe you swing a stick at the enemy every now and then, but it eventually levels up to get a bit more complex. At a certain point, you can start crafting these items that let you tap into your pal's signature abilities. Some let you ride them, use them as a flamethrower, or even give them a gun. Regardless, these are what really allows you to level up your combat ability, which is important because you'll quickly learn that this game can actually be kinda hard. Oh, and before we move on from combat, you don't really get guns throughout this entire tutorial part, so if you're expecting Pokemon with guns, you'll have to progress a bit first. I mean, technically you can use this monkey with a gun, but I don't know if I can count that. Anyway, let's talk more about the progression in this game. So much like Pokemon, pals have levels, but this time you have a level which acts as a sort of cap for your overall growth. Basically, you can't overlevel your Pokemon beyond your own. This is really not a problem since it indirectly encourages you to explore other areas of the game like catching pals and expanding your base. Outside of combat, the different pals in the game all have certain abilities that they're able to do in terms of helping the base. For example, some can cook food because they're fire types, while others can cool your freezer since they're ice types. To maximize your base's production while you're out exploring, you'll want to diversify your portfolio of pals and put them to work. Of course though, there's a catch. You have to build specific pieces of technology before you can upgrade your base, which allows you to put more pals to work. Every time you level up, you can unlock these technologies using skill points, and these are what truly allows you to progress in this game. I personally love how connected all of the different progressions are in this game, although I know it's not for everyone. Besides the technology tab, there's also the pal deck, which is basically the Pokédex, your party of pals, your guild, and your inventory. Obviously, since I just did a single player world at first, I don't have much experience with guilds, but as for inventory, this game has a weight system. And your weight is basically just how much stuff you're holding, but it's not based on the number of items in your inventory, it's based on what kind of items. For example, you can hold a ton of berries, but not as many rocks and ores. Since you're able to upgrade your character's stats, I personally recommend upgrading this first because you'll find your pockets getting full fast. Outside of all the progression stuff, we should take a look at the world and exploration in general. Honestly, it's nothing too impressive at the start. This video is only discussing the first few hours of the game, so keep that in mind. But I'm sure outside of the starting area, there are plenty of more interesting environments. What I've seen so far though is not bad at all. It's just a huge grassy area with some hills and a river, but I think it's perfect for learning the ropes. You even have a little Elden Ring style cave where you can get an idea of how dungeons work, although it is relatively simple. The best part of all of this is just seeing new pals show up in different places and times of the day. There's also high-level bosses roaming the world that you most certainly cannot handle at the start of the game, but it still gives you something to anticipate later. The other kind of bosses in this game are kind of a mix between a Dark Souls boss and a Pokemon gym leader. The first one is honestly really difficult if you haven't been training properly, and I think it's a great place to mark the end of the tutorial. Now that I've pretty much gone over all the basic stuff in the game, let's discuss if it's actually worth all the hype. First of all, consider that this game is in early access. Throughout my playthrough so far, I've experienced various auditory, visual, and gameplay glitches. Nothing game breaking, but you can tell that this game is not 100% finished yet. If we look into how the game has been developed though, things get even more interesting. First of all, this game's very existence is probably a miracle. I discovered this huge developer's note from Pocket Pair, the developers of the game, and it tells the story of how Palworld came to be. To sum it all up, a team of amateur developers with a poorly managed budget created a game that millions are enjoying every day now. So regardless of what I or anyone thinks of the game, I think we should certainly give it up to developers for doing the great job they've done over the past few years. I know a lot of people want to compare Palworld to the creations of much more financially capable companies like Game Freak, but that's not really fair, come on. But you know, honestly, Palworld doesn't even feel that much like Pokemon in terms of gameplay, besides maybe hints of it in the catching and battling system. It's a game that feels like a genuine mix of dozens of the best features of major games like Breath of the Wild, Ark Survival Evolved, and Rust. Something great I love about this game is the purpose it gives weaker pals. One of my biggest problems with Pokemon is how many of them just suck in combat and therefore don't really have any use. In Palworld though, many of the weaker pals are quite proficient when used to work in your base, which I can certainly appreciate. One thing I really don't like about Palworld though is how often you have to feed your pals when you're not at base. I don't know, it's not a huge deal, but it really does break the immersion when you're in the middle of combat and your pal needs to eat again after it's been like 5 minutes. With this all being said, is Palworld worth your time or money? Maybe. If you aren't familiar with the survival genre of games like me, maybe do some more research at first, because it's not for everyone. Also, if you're going into this game expecting a Pokemon clone, it's not one. Yeah, you know, now that I think about it, it's like this game really only feels like Pokemon when you're catching pals or something. There might be breeding, sure, but something like evolution isn't even in the game. And as for things like building bonds and connections with your pals, that's probably not going to be happening much. This game treats pals like true slaves, and you can do some pretty terrible things to them. Not only this, but the designs of the pals are barely interesting with a few exceptions. I mean, I understand Pokemon doesn't also have the best designs at times either, but come on, this is literally just a chicken. Anyway, for me personally, I think that this game is absolutely worth a shot if you have Game Pass already. If you have to go and buy it though, maybe watch some more gameplay and see if it's your cup of tea. Also, you can get it on Steam, and if you don't like it, you can refund the game as long as you've played under 2 hours. Regardless, I think that this game is most likely going to fizzle out after a while. Probably not to complete obscurity, but don't expect this hype to last forever. It really depends on if this company continues to support the game with frequent updates, since there's a ton that needs to be fixed. I've still got to try the game out in multiplayer though, and from what I've seen, I think Palworld is mostly worth it.